atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this afternoon?
Well, I guess I'd say it depends on the context.
Yeah, I suppose it does. Yeah. Well, we will be talking about that context and a whole bunch of other things, including the latest Hunter Biden indictment, Ukraine and Israel funding, the Nevada fake elector indictments. A lot of indictments today, Jay, at least on this show.
Right. A lot of justice getting done.
There you go. Exactly.
This end of the week, Mike.
A bunch of other stuff as well. And before we get to all of that, I just wanted to first off thank our newest supporters. There's Scott, who became a yearly Patreon supporter, where you can save 10% over monthly support. So thank you, Scott. Also, 2 new free trial Patreon supporters. That's a thing you can do, Elijah and Roy. So thank all of you for becoming supporters. And just a reminder, for a reminder that from now until the end of the year, if you become a new supporter or you increase your level of support, we'll make a donation matching the amount of your support for a month to Feeding America, is the largest hunger relief organization in the United States. It's a really solid charity. And so if you've been considering supporting the show or increasing your support level, this would be a great time to do it, because you'll not only be helping us, you'll be helping to feed some Americans in need. One other thing before we get started, I put together a new Politics Guys listener survey. It's been a while since we've done one. Just a few short questions. It gives us a better idea of who you are, so we can try to give you more of what you like and maybe less of what you don't in the coming year. It's super short. It's really easy. It will take literally a minute or less. And I mean literally, as in literally. It's completely anonymous, and there will be a link to the survey in the show notes. So thank you very much for helping us out with that. All right, with that out of the way, let's get started. Late this week, Special Counsel David Weiss indicted Hunter Biden on 9 tax-related charges, 3 felonies and 6 misdemeanors. In the indictment, prosecutors say that Biden left unpaid at least $1.5 million in federal taxes from 2016 to 2019, and that he spent millions of dollars on an extravagant lifestyle rather than paying his tax bills. Spending that included drugs, escorts, girlfriends, luxury hotels, exotic cars, with business expenses including exotic dancers, strip clubs, pornography, and a $10,000 sex club membership. That's some club.
If you've ever wondered how much it costs to join a sex club,
it's probably one of the better ones. But anyway,
well, that's what I understand. That, like, one of the allegations, like, he was kicked out of one of your
lower end ones. I don't know. Anyway, I am unfamiliar with the sex club world, but also prosecutors say Biden was well aware that he owed these taxes. One of the things they cited was a text from his ex-wife to him saying, "Hey, I found some unfiled tax returns in the trunk of your car." So that would be a good indication. Anyway, Biden's attorney said, based on the facts and the law, if Hunter's last name was anything other than Biden, the charges in Delaware, those gun charges that Weiss also filed earlier, and now California, would not have been brought. He also repeated claims that Weiss basically caved into Republican pressure to renege on the previous plea deal, which would have included these tax charges. Now, in addition to this, House Republicans are continuing their separate and broader investigation of the Biden family's financial dealings. In fact, they recently subpoenaed Hunter Biden to testify behind closed doors. Biden responded to this that he would be willing to testify in an open hearing, but not a private one, out of concerns that Republicans would selectively leak things or mischaracterize private testimony. Now, Representative Jim Comer, who's the chair of the Oversight Committee, and Jim Jordan, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, they responded to this in a joint letter this week, saying that Biden wasn't allowed to set the terms of his own testimony and that he would be held in contempt if he doesn't appear on December 13th as the subpoena demands. So right now, we're in kind of an interesting, strange, sad place. The Justice Department is engaged in prosecutions of the son of the current president, sitting president of the United States, as well as Donald Trump, the sitting president's almost certain opponent in the upcoming election. So there's a lot there. Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's always one of those when you get the announcement like an indictment, right? It's hard to, do a whole lot more to say, what does this mean? Where is it going other than what's in the indictment? Look, I think it's overall, it's good, right? This is what Republicans have wanted for some time. Now, I think there's an argument that can be made and probably will be made that, by delaying this, he gets off the hook for some of the other back tax charges, because the statute of limitations will have run. And I think that's not a bad political argument to make. But reading the indictment and reading about the indictment, it doesn't look good for Hunter. Again, to me, I think it's the other bigger point of this, and you brought that up, is whatever Hunter spent his money on, which I got to tell you, according $190,000 on adult entertainment in 4 years.
That's a lot of adult entertainment.
It is, yeah. $680,000 on various women, is what the thing says. But
the point, and your point, I think, is that he could have spent it on puppies and rainbows, and it wouldn't matter. I mean, that's just more the kind of, and admittedly, I talked about because it's salacious stuff. But Biden himself has said that, hey, he had a serious drug problem during this time, and he just went completely off the rails. I mean, it seems to me that the basic narrative, at least, if not the facts, the narrative isn't really in question. I mean, there was a reason he was willing to plead to these charges in that other agreement.
Yeah, no. The bigger point, obviously, to me, is not what he did, but where did he get the money? And I think that's right. The bigger, if this is money that was received through sort of an influence peddling type arrangement, that's the real story here. Not that Biden. I would say yes. The younger Biden. Yeah. So I think, look, I on the one hand, I think it's good news when we're going after somebody who is seems to be a serial tax evader, so that's good. I think it's good that when we prosecute folks and you get the message that no one is above the law, even the son of the president. So those are two good takeaways. But the more troubling thing and the other shoe to drop, obviously, is where did this money come from and what was he being paid for?
Well, I think it seems to me, at least, and I've been certainly following this, that at least some of this money came from Biden's salary or whatever perks as being a consultant, analyst, call it what you will. There are various titles, right? There's involvement in Ukraine. There's involvement, I think, that's connected to China, some other foreign entities. Yeah, where
all jobs to which he seemed not particularly well suited.
Well, sure, but the point being is that he was the son of the vice president and then the previous vice president after Biden left office, and so there was a presumption that Biden could potentially provide access to government at the highest levels. And it seems clear to me, reviewing what we've been able to see so far, is that he certainly promised or certainly hinted very strongly that there would be this influence. Where the dot has not been connected, the line has not been connected, is whether or not this was just some horribly troubled, drug-addled guy on the make who was just spinning lies, or whether or not there was, in fact, some sort of arrangement that in some way involved Joe Biden. And that is, as you point out correctly, that is the critical part of this, but that is also the part of this for which there is, as of yet, no hard evidence that we have seen.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say no hard evidence, but I would agree with you that the dot has not been connected yet.
I wanted to ask you about that wider investigation that House Republicans are doing. What do you think about the private versus public hearing thing? Because when I heard that, I thought, well, other things being equal, I would, unless it's a national security thing, I think it should be a public open hearing. And it kind of makes me wonder why Republicans would want to do that in secret. And I wanted to get your take on that.
So I think the plan, the reason they would do this is for the same reason in court. Sometimes you call for sequestration of witnesses. And that's so that you don't have the one witness go in and all the other ones are sitting there listening. Let this person tell his story, and then you're like, okay, now I know what the story is. I'm just going to say what he said. The idea is to sort of trip people up. That if you ask Hunter questions privately and he gives you one answer, and you ask someone else who was supposedly in the same meeting or something like that, and he gives you different answers, then you've got something of interest. Whereas if the Hunter story is all open and broadcast, and it's sort of that sort of tells any other potential witnesses, here's what the story we're going with. So I mean, I think the having a closed hearing, it's an imperfect way to get that, right? Because, there's nothing that really stops Hunter from picking up the phone after he gets out of the hearing, or anybody else from leaking and so forth. I mean, there's rules against leaking, but again, difficult to enforce. So I think that's my sense of why they want it. They want him on the record, and then they want to be able to interview other witnesses and see if the stories are consistent.
Which sounds a lot more like an investigation that is a prosecution as opposed to fact finding for the purposes of legislation.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But keep in mind,
the weaponization of government. I think that's the term, isn't it?
I don't know if it's. I mean, I think you can still say, look, it's fact finding, right? I mean, you're trying to find out what happened here as part of kind of legitimate government oversight. So yeah, I mean, I think any kind of congressional inquiry in this has some parallel to prosecution. But
I guess one thing to keep in mind on this is that as long as the Democrats on the committee are going to be there, then presumably they could counter the Republican leaks with their own leaks and the Republican spin with their own spin. Although ideally, we would not, the public, we would prefer to actually see the source documents, as it were, as opposed to getting each party's highly partisan spin. Because I would expect this hearing to leak quite a lot on both sides.
Yeah. Well, if you remember think back the Adam Schiff hearings over collusion and so forth, and Jim Comey and all that, right? Those interviews were closed door private. Now, I think you could make a better argument there that there were national security pieces involved, right? That's not to say that there isn't a potential national security, issue with Hunter, because we don't know where these questions are going to necessarily go. So I wouldn't completely discount that, but it's obviously not the same type of. The investigation itself isn't focused on, what could be international espionage.
How do you see this playing out? I mean, it's early. The indictment just came out. Is this the sort of thing where you could envision another plea deal? Because I think at this point that would be politically pretty challenging to pull off, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think they could offer him a plea deal that he would take.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, he wasn't really taking the last one unless there were these special circumstances that the judge said she just couldn't give him. So Yeah, I think it plays out that way. And look, I mean, I think if he gets indicted, I think or if he gets convicted, I think he gets pardoned on the way out or in the next 4 years.
We will certainly follow along as this develops. All right. Well, moving on Wednesday, Senate Republicans blocked consideration of the Biden administration's $111 billion emergency aid package to Ukraine and Israel over what they view as an insufficient focus on the security of the U.S. southern border. Now, Senate Republicans would like to see a package that includes as much as possible of what the House passed, H.R. 2, that's the Secure the Border Act of 2023. This was passed back in May of this year on pretty much on a party line vote. That legislation would, I could say, it would largely reestablish Trump-era policy, a border wall construction with benchmarks for how much you would hit, significantly limit access, eligibility for asylum, that sort of thing.
And parole is the other new big piece of it.
The other big piece of it. Yeah, exactly. So before the vote on this on Wednesday, Majority Leader Schumer said, why hold up Ukraine aid if they can't even present a border package that can pass the Senate? We're asking ourselves this question. Has border been nothing more than an excuse for the hard right to kill funding for Ukraine? And too many other Republican senators who are not part of the hard right are going along? I hope that's not true. Now, well,
rest assured, Chuck, it's not.
I want to ask you that. So, yeah. Now, this all comes at a time when the Biden administration has been repeatedly warning Congress that funding for Ukraine will run out by the end of this year, which obviously isn't that far away at this point. In fact, in a nationally televised address on Wednesday, Biden said, I think it's stunning that we've gotten to this point in the first place. Republicans in Congress are willing to give Putin the greatest gift he can hope for and abandon our global leadership. Biden said he was willing to make significant compromises on the border, which he characterized as broken, but said, Republicans think they can get everything they want without any bipartisan compromise. That's not the answer. And now they're willing to literally kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and endanger our national security in the process. Now, in the last day or two, it's been reported that the White House is endorsing several new immigration restrictions, including tightening the screening process for people seeking asylum, designating various countries as safe third countries where the government can deport migrants, as well as expanding rapid deportations to be used nationwide rather than just at the border. So, Jay, you already answered one question I had. You don't think that the border is an excuse to kill funding for Ukraine. So what do you think is going on here? And how do you see this potentially ending?
Well, I think the border is a big legitimate issue for Republicans and I think a growing number of Democrats. And this is an opportunity to get some action on it. This is the way the sausage is made, right? I mean, Biden's got a big ask, which will be, for some Republicans, a heavy lift. They have, I think, an ask that shouldn't be that hard of a lift, right? But yet seems to be. And I think I don't think you can deny that the border situation has gotten progressively worse. I mean, I'm hearing numbers of, we're having like 10,000 people a day, and those are the encounters. Those don't count even the getaways. That's tremendous. I mean, I'm trying to think. There's numbers I saw that something along the lines of I mean, several million since the beginning of the Biden administration. There was total like 1.4 million, and I apologize. I'm kind of.
I'll say that since we're not looking at the same numbers here, and sometimes the numbers reported in the media on both sides tend to be the largest, most dramatic numbers. Another thing I'll point out is that when Title 42 ended, as it rightly should have ended, because we no longer had a state of emergency regarding the pandemic, that changed things a lot as well in a way that really doesn't have to do with policy, just with following the law, basically. But
right. Well, yes and no, because you could have just then made a new policy or put together a new law.
Yeah, and I'll also point out
to replace it.
I'll also point out that congressional Democrats have been less interested in dealing on this than Biden has. In the initial package, I believe the Biden administration put in something like $14 billion for border security. And the package that was actually presented by Democrats in Congress was around $10 billion. That's a pretty significant cut. So I think Biden's ahead of his party in a good way on this. And
I would agree. And I would agree that I think Biden realizes he's got a big vulnerability here on this.
Definitely.
I would say that, of that 14 billion, not a lot of it was for, I guess, less preventing the problem. It wasn't building walls, deporting people. It was more for immigrant services once they got here, which I think Republicans rightly said, well, that wasn't exactly what we're talking about. The other thing, which again, you can either give kudos to Biden for this, or I can say finally we get an error by the other team. He was the Biden administration was the entity that linked border security with Ukraine that put this in the bill in the first place. So the past couple of days, there's been sort of a Democratic push on how can you possibly link these two things? Yeah. Well, it was Biden who linked them. And again, this is the way politics gets done and sausage gets made. They've got something they really want that's a hard lift for us. We've got something we really want. Let's get it done. I mean, actually, I'm me, like I want both.
Me
I'm very
too.
much in favor of arming the Ukrainians to the teeth.
And I'll point out,
but at the same time, I would be, you'd sort of be committing political malpractice if you didn't say, look, here we got a great opportunity to try to do something about the border, which you can say, one, okay, it's a really good political issue for us, but two, I think there's got to be some realization, and I'm not saying you're not the one who realizes it, because you do, and I think Biden does. This is becoming a substantial problem.
Yeah, and the closer Ukraine gets to actually running out, the more leverage on immigration congressional Republicans have.
Yeah,
and I'll also point out that while you and
I'm not exactly sure how that works. Of running out.
Well,
right?
I mean,
it's is it the last bullet, or you know what I mean? I'm
but
sure
still, there's a point at which it goes from being concerning to desperate to actually aiding Russia.
Yeah,
and the closer it gets to that point, the more leverage there is. And I'll also point out that while you and I agree on the Ukraine issue, and we're of course both right.
And Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell too, and Joe Biden. But there are a lot of Americans who don't. We've spent around $100 billion or so on Ukraine so far. And if you take a look at recent polling, somewhere around 45% of Americans say we're spending too much. 60%, nearly 60% of Republicans. And there are a lot of polls that show this. And so if you are one of these Republican members, you have to start thinking about what do your constituents want. And it's not only about leverage, it's about listening to your constituents. Now, that I think is a wrong policy choice, but for both of those reasons, it makes sense politically. And I only hope that this brinksmanship ends up resulting in funding both for the border, Ukraine, and certainly Israel would be part of that, because that's why the Biden administration initially put that in there as well.
Yeah. So I would say this, and I think there are some Republicans who are anti-Ukraine for a whole other reasons. You're not going to turn them around. But I think there's also a segment of those who you're talking about who, when the question is sort of put to them of should we be funding Ukraine, or should we be doing something about the border, they're going to put the border higher up. So if you have a solution where you can say, listen, we're going to do both, or at least partially both, I think you get those people on board. So I don't think it's necessarily a opposition to funding the Ukraine. It's more looking of do we have higher priorities where we should be spending money here, and we're not. So I think if we do spend that, then the Ukraine bit becomes more palatable for some Republicans.
So do you think there'll be some sort of compromise that comes out before the end of the year?
I do. Yeah.
I do too. So let's hope we're both right, because that would be, I think, a win-win in a lot of ways. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to some more indictments. Yes, we have more indictments on this show. This week, a Nevada grand jury indicted 6 top-level state Republican officials for signing certificates falsely claiming to be the legitimate representative of the state's voters in the Electoral College. These 6 alternate electors, they include the head of the state Republican Party as one of them, and they've been charged with offering a false instrument for filing and uttering a forged instrument. Those are the 2 charges. A number of them say, hey, we were told by attorneys that what we were doing was okay, and it would basically just be a way to keep Donald Trump's options open if he succeeded in court challenges to the election outcome. Although the charges, both of these charges, are felonies that have penalties ranging from 1 to 5 years in prison. And Nevada's not alone here. It's the 3rd state to bring these charges, the other 2 being Michigan and Georgia. And also this week, there are 10 Republicans who did the same thing in Wisconsin. They settled a civil lawsuit in which they admitted their actions were part of an attempt to improperly overturned the 2020 election results. And under the terms of that settlement, now they made no admission of liability or culpability. Like in Nevada, the common claim was, well, we thought what we were doing was legal and it could help Trump if he won his court challenges. So we've been seeing a bunch of these things pop up, Jay. How do you view this?
I'm not crazy about these. We can remember when Hillary Clinton floated that idea not long before the election that maybe there should be a other slate, and the idea of disloyal electors. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Unfaithful electors.
Well, that's a different thing, though. That's a different thing.
Well, no, but there was also a plan about seeking to but anyway, no, I'm against prosecuting folks for this sort of thing, especially for felonies. If you have facts that show that these people legitimately knew that Trump had lost the election in their state, I think you've got then maybe a good argument on the forgery and uttering charges. But if they are just a matter of, look, you were the elector for Donald Trump, and we're telling you as a matter of procedurally, sign the form, and then it sort of keeps everything in play and let the courts decide. I think that's sort of criminalizing politics. Again, I think the whole Trump plan, right, in doing this was a very, very bad, terrible legal idea. But that doesn't, make it a crime. And I think the people who went along with this were maybe not thinking everything through. But I mean, again, I think it goes back to, look, if you had a legitimate belief that the election was stolen, that massive fraud had occurred in your state, and that you were the rightful elector. It's almost like you have a duty to do this. And if you're told by the attorneys, well, this is the procedural thing you have to do.
Well, we've had this argument regarding Trump, and we're on different sides of this. I think that for one thing, it's one thing to talk about theoretically some sort of alternate electors. It's another thing to actually present yourself as one. And also this idea that, well, if you believe deep down in your soul, in your heart, you just know my guy couldn't have possibly lost. That's not necessarily a defense, because if a reasonable person would not believe that, then you just can't say, well, I'm delusional. So, that wouldn't be a defense for Trump. That's not a defense for these people. I'm not saying, Jay, that isn't a defense they can legitimately offer. Of course it is. But that's not, in my view, a reason to not prosecute people, because presumably the prosecutors believe that these folks knew this was wrong. They knew Trump had lost. And in fact, those 10 Republicans in Wisconsin signed a statement saying that they knew this was part of an attempt to improperly overturn the election, improperly being the operative word here. So, I mean, it's for a jury to decide, but I don't think that it's in any way politicizing, or not politicizing, but using the justice criminalizing. Thank you, politics. It's criminalizing criminal activity, which, hey, I'm all for, actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess don't you think though this might be one of those instances where prosecutorial discretion might be wise, just depending on the facts. And again, I will concede if you've got folks who are like, hey, we got a really good scheme to overthrow what is a legitimate election. Let's execute on it. Absolutely, those people should be subject to being prosecuted. But I'm not sure that you get absent those facts, and maybe they do have those facts in some cases, but I don't think they have those facts in all cases. I mean, I know plenty of. Well,
they had enough of those facts to convince grand juries to issue indictments.
Yeah, but the old saying is, you can indict a ham sandwich, and
except you can't. I mean, but also it seems like partisans on one side or another are awfully quick to dismiss indictments as illegitimate, whereas I just think that there's
enough. I'm not dismissing it as illegitimate, but I'm saying an indictment is something different than a conviction.
Sure, absolutely.
Is a finding of probable cause.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. One other thing I'll point out is that I agree with the prosecutorial discretion, but in this case, I would feel that if one were kind of on the fence, the way to go actually would be to seek an indictment. And that's because I am thinking about, well, how this sort of activity, how these indictments, how this whole thing playing out would look to people in 2024 or beyond who are saying like, well, this attorney for Trump or whoever else is saying, yeah, go ahead and say you're elector. I know technically you're not, but it's good. Maybe they'll think, you know what? Maybe I should check with an attorney who's not representing the candidate who would like to overturn the results of the election. I want people to have a little bit of pause before they advance kind of out there extremist claims that are on the fringes of legality. I think that's a healthy chilling effect. And so, I think back to what you've said a number of times about many of these court cases and the state to which, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and some of these other formerly prominent and reasonably well-respected people have come. Other folks are going to look at that and say, is that who I want to be? Do I want to get out in front of these crazy claims? Or do I want to maybe save my reputation, my career, and maybe my freedom? And yeah, I think that's a healthy system where people have a reasonable caution about doing crazy stuff they think may be illegal because, what the hell, no one's going to prosecute it. So I think this is a good thing.
So let me give you a hypothetical.
Okay.
It is back in the time machine, and we are in this time of year in the year 2000 in Florida. And you are an elector for Al Gore. And everything you're seeing, hearing, and reading tells you that Al Gore won the election in Florida and therefore won the presidency. You believe in your heart of hearts that the butterfly ballots were set up and manipulated by Republican operatives to confuse people, and therefore those votes were illegitimate. You believe that the recount was prematurely stopped for political reasons, and otherwise Al Gore would have won. Do you sign the letter if you reasonably believe that this,
there's no letter to sign.
Correct.
There's no letter to sign. If you are the Gore elector in a state that the Secretary of State certifies that Bush won, you have no role. Now you can sign a letter to the Washington Post or New York Times. You can protest. You can bring a court case. But the one thing you cannot do is present yourself as an elector because you are not an elector. So there are ways you can say, I believe this this process was wrong, but that is not one of them. That is illegitimate. And if you do that, knowing it's illegitimate, you can and you should be prosecuted.
What if Gore was right?
Doesn't matter. That's not your call. That's not your job.
Okay.
Any more
that's a
than
good answer.
Okay.
That's an excellent answer. That's probably the answer that I would give.
It's got to be a good answer then.
Well, no, yeah, but I guess let's think of another Pennsylvania, right? There were issues with Pennsylvania about the way ballots were counted and when they were sent and received, and they were supposed to be segregated by date, but then they weren't. And the state Supreme Court sort of punted on this. And I think there were a lot of issues in Pennsylvania. Now, were they enough to change the balance of the election? No, it turns out that they weren't. But what happens when, that it's but for the not finding out that what if you were right? What if
again?
Right?
I'm not saying that there may not be or couldn't potentially be issues with elections that could affect the outcome, but that is not the role of the electors or the slate of electors. That's not their job to decide, any more than if you are a citizen and you feel the election was wrongly decided, you don't get to storm the Capitol and try to hang Mike Pence. That's not your job. That's not your role. There are other avenues to pursue that. We have a system based on the rule of law.
Hang Mike Pence.
Well, you don't get to go outside of that system just because you're upset, even if you're legitimately upset. That's not how it works. That's not how our political system is set up, and for good reason. Because if you set up a system that way, you get frontier justice and chaos.
Wow. All right. Well, those are actually. I mean, I think those are good answers. I'm just being devil's advocate and sort of thinking through this of.
But
what happens? What about? Well, no, that gets too complicated.
There are a lot of hypotheticals you can spin on this, I'm sure. But no matter which one you do, I'm going to say that if you're the elector, you look to the result the Secretary of State certified, and if it's that your party won, to which you're an elector, then you get the vote. And if not, you can complain all you want, you can sue all you want, but the one thing you cannot do is say, no, I actually am an elector, because you're not.
Okay.
All right.
Right. A strong voice for law and order
there
here.
You go. Absolutely. Mike Law and Order Baranowski. I don't know. I like that kind of. All right. Well, speaking of law and order, let's talk about another law case. This one.
Before we do, let me just throw out one last piece, because this is where it gets me, right? Is my concern would be, and I think this is a concern that a little bit was thrown out. That was one of the stories we were going to talk about, but then didn't talk about, or we'll hit on the bonus show. Is political retribution, right? Is there a concern that someone serving as an elector, now again, a slate, just because the way is I don't know, I'm sure our listeners understand, but the way it works in actual presidential elections is even before the election, right? Each candidate has their own slate of electors, and when you vote for that candidate, you're really voting for that slate of electors. So those folks are all named ahead of time, and as you correctly point out, they're usually party bigwigs and that kind of thing. But what if somebody, again, my concern is you step up and say, if someone came to me and said, would you be willing to serve as an elector for this candidate on the slate? It's like an honorary thing,
exactly.
Right?
It's
but if your guy loses, then should you be in fear of someone coming after you? Now, again, what these folks did was different. They didn't just say, I was on the slate of electors. They said, I was actually elected. And that's a different animal. But it still strikes me as it's one of these.
And I would also
criminalizing political participation.
Let me say this: you could have presumably an elector who was from the slate that was not certified by the Secretary of State could write a letter saying, although the Secretary of State did not certify me as an elector, I believe this to be an error, and I'm sure there are legal means, and you could say I am pursuing legal means and so forth.
Right.
But that would be another avenue to kind of get that out in a more official way without actually putting yourself out as being something that you are legally not.
Right.
So.
All right. Those are all good answers.
Well, but the bigger question maybe is going back to that issue of the system worked, right? And it seems to me that you can make a good case for that, right? And I would think, and I wanted to get your take on that in 2024, I assume it's going to be a close election. I assume that many of these same issues and temptations will present themselves. But I believe that at least the sort of top level people, the respectable people, will think twice before they do some of these things. And I think I understand what you're saying, that you don't want people to be reluctant to get involved in a worthy and reasonable cause. But some of the causes that some fairly prominent folks were involved with were neither worthy nor reasonable. And I think it's good to have a warning to those people that's saying that, hey, if you do crazy stuff, we're going to come after you if it's illegal. And you would agree with that or not?
I would, yeah. But I think there is there is always a potential chilling effect when you go after someone. And you're saying it's a good chilling effect, and I suppose it is to some extent. But then you also wonder why Matt Taibbi had an IRS agent visit his house the day he was testifying before Congress. You know what I'm saying? And you're going to say this is a slippery slope kind of thing, but that's just my concern. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying. I'm
not saying you're wrong.
I'm pointing out that there is too much of a chilling effect can be bad, and governments once they get a sense of that chilling effect, tend to like to expand it.
Oh, I think it's definitely happening now on both sides. There's very little question in my mind. And so the question then becomes, well, in what areas is that legitimate and what areas is it criminalizing politics? And I think that there are clearly instances in which both sides have decided that there is a lot to be gained from criminalizing politics.
Yeah. Okay.
Which really kind of stinks.
All right, no, this is good. No, this is sort of like a Socratic discussion kind of thing absolutely. Of where does this line fall? So, all right, sorry, let's move. Let's keep moving. What do we got next?
All right, so this week the Supreme Court, they heard oral argument in Moore versus United States, and the question,
they sure did.
Yeah, the question the court's being asked to decide is if a particular sort of tax is a tax on income, and this is an important question, because the 16th Amendment gives Congress the power to collect income taxes without apportionment. That means that it doesn't have to be proportional to a state's population. And this opens the door to all sorts of progressive or, I guess, regressive taxes, so long as they're based on income. Now, the genesis of this particular case actually comes from a Trump-era law, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. One part of this attempted to
which most of I like.
Yeah, but I actually like parts of it as well, I recall. But one part of it tried to discourage U.S. companies from keeping money abroad by lowering some taxes on foreign profits. But what it also did, it put in place a one-time tax on past foreign earnings called the transition tax. And the Moores, Charles and Kathleen Moore, they invested $40,000 in an Indian company called Kinsencraft in 2006. Now, they claim they never got any returns from this investment because the company reinvested all the profits. But despite this, they were taxed $15,000 on that $40K due to the transition tax based on the company's earnings. And so what the Moores are arguing is, wait a second, these were unrealized gains. That's not income. And the reason why this is a big deal is that, according to the government, a ruling in the Moores' favor would be a massive disruption to the U.S. tax code that would result in several trillion, trillion with a T, in lost revenue. So a really big deal. Now, what Moore's attorneys are arguing is, hey, forever, income is understood as being a gain that's received. And so if you're taxing them on unrealized income, what you're doing is sort of taxing them on their property.
Wealth tax.
Yeah, and that's not permissible. Now, the Solicitor General argued that, well, if you take a look at the text and the history of the 16th Amendment, that supports allowing Congress to enact this transition tax, and that it's sufficient that this was income that a foreign corporation received that Congress permissibly attributed to a U.S. shareholder of that company. So essentially, the argument here is that the income was in fact realized by the company, and as shareholders in the company, the Moores are fair game for taxation here. And
yeah, if that were the case, then you should only be taxed once on.
So I want to get into that, but a majority of the justices, it seems to me, are inclined to agree with the government here. Now, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas, they were the ones I think who led the way in expressing some concerns that if a ruling for the government would basically allow Congress too much taxing authority. Alito, who in fact was actually called on by some to recuse himself, he had some fairly kind of vague ties to an attorney involved with the Moores. He pushed the hardest here, and he seemed pretty unpersuaded by the government's argument that basically the government argued that there's no tradition of our imposing these sort of taxes that you're talking about, Justice Alito, so don't worry about taxes on stock value appreciation or the value of mutual funds. So that's basically how things played out in oral argument, and I think it's a fairly safe bet that the court is not going to side with the Moores here, and probably a fairly narrow ruling. What do you think, Jay?
I'm not going to make any predictions at this point, but I will say that the idea of being taxed on unrealized gains is horrific.
Horrific?
Yes.
Okay, I want to explain that word, because that's
thrown out there that. Well, look, I mean, it's
genocide is horrific, but being taxed on unrealized gains, that would maybe suck, I guess. But
it could well drive a lot of people into poverty.
I doubt that,
if your home is appreciating at a good clip, you would get this increasing tax bill. Now you already get one, right, from your state or local, depending on how that's worked out and when they do evaluations and so forth. But if the federal government can tax, your home equity and your growth in home equity when you're not taking advantage of it, then what's the incentive for putting money into a 401k?
This is why that's a bad argument, Jay. And this is the Solicitor General's argument. I mean, under the current constitutional authority of Congress could tax all income from $0 at 100%. That would be horrific. That would definitely put a whole bunch of people into poverty. Why doesn't Congress do that?
Well, because it would be politically unpopular.
There you go. That's the answer there. So just because Congress has the authority to do something doesn't mean that would hurt people. Doesn't mean that they're going to do those things. And many of those things would be political suicide. And so that was I feel like the crux of the Solicitor General's argument here. So I think that was enough to persuade, I would say, at least 6 of the justices not to issue a ruling that would basically overturn a big swath of the tax code. Now, what I will say is I kind of agree with you. After saying that's kind of weird.
I should hope so.
Let me explain.
Go ahead.
So the 16th Amendment, I just want to read this because it's important. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Now, to me, there's one word there that's really important, derived. So that from whatever source derived. So that income has to be derived. If it's not derived, then it cannot be taxed. It's right there in the text. And so my reading of that, sort of a plain common sense reading, is that Moore's attorney is right, and that under the Constitution, you can't tax unrealized income because it's not actual income. It hasn't been realized. But this is one of these instances in which basically pragmatism is going to trump constitutionality. I'm not crazy about it, but we've seen this before in the court. I mean, just like I've said in many instances, I think Justice Thomas has a better logical argument, but we're not going to go and overturn 100, 200 years, whatever, of jurisprudence and throw everything into chaos just so we can be intellectually consistent. And I think that's why a majority of the court is not going to do the, I would argue, constitutionally pure thing that would be economically disastrous. Because, Jay, it's one thing to overturn, I don't know, say a long settled precedent on reproductive rights, but boy, you mess with the tax code and they're going to come out with the long knives to get you. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. So my reasons for not putting as much faith in political protections are one, the reason we have this in the Constitution is because it sort of ought to serve as a protection against the political branches. There is a power that the government essentially said, Congress, you can go this far, but no further. When the 16th Amendment was ratified, I mean, the purpose it was sold on, the purpose that the income tax was sold on, right, was, gosh, we got to fund World War One. And once that's over, there won't be any need for this, and it would be unpopular. So why would we keep doing it? But here we are, and I think the sense that the government is not going to always want more money is naive. Now they'll start saying, well, we only want to get it, only want to take it from the millionaires and billionaires and so forth. But as you and I have talked a lot about, that there just aren't enough of those billionaires to tax. And then you start getting into the middle class, and you start, again, folks who maybe own a small business, who built that up, and again, all the income has come into the business, which is a separate corporate entity than an individual. They get taxed on what they take out of it, and so in that case, you're actually getting taxed twice. You're getting taxed on the corporate tax, and then on the personal income tax when you realize the gain from the corporation. They would expand that just even directly to. I mean, I think I think it's really problematic, and I don't see the. I see more of a political appetite here for mischief than what you do.
Well, except that what the court's going to do is they're going to rule in a way that doesn't really change the settled understanding of Congress's power here. So it's not going to be an expansion. It's going to be a narrow ruling. It's not going to expand governmental power. And the greatest check on governmental power is definitely not the Constitution. The Constitution can go by the wayside, and we've seen it happen time and time again in times of crisis and fear and what have you. The greatest check is the democratic process, the fact that politicians have to stand for re-election. And that is why you won't see these crazy, insane taxes that you're worried about. The slippery slope stops at a point because we are a democracy. And so I am not worried about this because it's just not going to happen.
All right. I take the opposite view that one of the reasons we enshrine a lot of rights or put limitations on government is to protect us from the tyranny of the majority. And we are not a pure democracy. We are a republic. And you get into, this is what got Mitt Romney in trouble, right? That, do you get to a moral hazard point where you have less than 50% of the people paying almost all of the taxes?
Boy, and we're so far from that right now.
Well, I know, but hear me out, right? I mean, if it's always a matter of, well, sure, I'll vote to tax someone else, and I'm just saying experience. It doesn't tend to stop there.
Yeah, I guess I'd be concerned about that if there actually were tax increases that looked like the significant tax increases that looked like they had any sort of political traction that I felt were extreme.
Right. Well, I mean, Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax a number of times.
I don't have a problem with that. No, I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. Absolutely. But that's a whole other issue, obviously.
There you go. That's.
Oh, yeah. All right.
You just assume it's someone else's wealth she's going to tax.
No, not necessarily. I'm a supporter of a lot of taxes that hit me. I'd like to think that I have an obligation to give back to the society that takes care of the infrastructure and other things. I tend to vote for most tax levies, and those are the taxes, of course, that are have the most immediate effect. So every election, I don't think there's an election that goes by that I don't end up voting for a tax that comes down on me. So it's not at all about I just want to make my tax bill as low as possible and the hell with everyone else. I don't think you probably feel that way either, though.
Oh, I don't know.
We don't need libraries and schools and all that. Screw it. I just want my
no. Well, again, I have less objection, when it comes to local stuff than I do to federal stuff. For sort of those very reasons, right? I think there would be a tremendous slippery slope once you can start taxing wealth.
Yeah, and as usual,
why would they not do it?
And as usual, I must have my my hiking boots on because I am so much less concerned about slipping down slippery slopes than you are. You are the guy with the waxed up toboggan at the top of the hill, just going down every slippery slope. Whereas anyway, I will stop there on that. And speaking of stopping there, we're about at that point. There's a lot we didn't get to. I'm sure you're itching to talk about college presidents and anti-Semitism, a big story.
I am. I want to hear about, especially your take on college
We're going to talk about that and a bunch of other things in the midweek show that I am really looking forward to, some stuff on Israel, some other Congress stuff. And so we hope if you are a supporter, you'll get a chance to listen to that. And if you're not a supporter, we hope we'll consider becoming one. And just remember also as well, whether you're a supporter or not, it would really help us out if you filled out that anonymous listener survey. Again, the link is in the show notes. And if you do decide you want to become a supporter, you get a bunch of stuff with that support. Ad-free episodes, the full-length version of our midweek show. There's access to our Politics Guys Discord group where I'm on there all the time. Trey's on there. You can interact with us, other listeners. There are always some interesting conversations. And also,
and if you're a supporter and your 401k increases dramatically, we won't touch that.
No, not at all.
You're limited to your support amount. So.
Absolutely, yes. We can't get into there. We have no taxing authority or anything like that. But also, you get a chance at some levels to. Like John and Nathan today, they joined us here for the recording. They get to hear us warts and all before I try my best to make us sound better through post-production. So anyway, guys, again, thanks for joining us. We do appreciate that. So to find out more about all that, you can either go to the show notes. We always have those links. You can go to patreon.com/politicsguys and just get all the info there. And also, if you just want to get in touch with us for whatever reason, you can email us at mail@politicsguys.com. Get in touch with us on Discord. We're also on Facebook and X. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.